The door slammed shut, the iron lock clicking into place with a finality that chilled more than the damp air. A boy, frail, wide-eyed, trembling in the shadows of a cellar no bigger than a cage, curled into himself, trying to silence the soft whimpers escaping his lips. His name was Samuel, a 12-year-old with autism, who loved drawing horses in the dirt and counting the stars. But tonight, there were no stars. Only concrete, darkness, and the cold that gnawed at his small frame. Above, in a mansion of polished marble and chandeliers, his father, a billionaire known more for power than kindness, raised a glass of wine as if nothing had happened. To the world, he was a man of influence, a symbol of wealth. To Samuel, he was a monster. What the man didn't know, however, was that someone else had seen everything. Someone silent, loyal, and waiting just beyond the shadows of the paddock. A white horse with a mane like silver silk, whose eyes carried a depth of knowing no human could ignore. And as the wind howled through the night, the horse stomped its hooves, restless. Because it knew where the boy was. And it knew it had to act. This is their story. The prairie had a way of slowing time. In autumn, the fields around the Hallstrom estate stretched golden and wide, swaying like a living sea beneath the crisp wind. The town nearby was small, quiet, filled with wooden porches and smoke curling from chimneys, but the estate itself was another world, white stone walls, iron gates, and manicured gardens that felt more like a fortress than a home. For Samuel Hallstrom, it was a place of silence. At 12 years old, Samuel lived in a world that few understood. He was autistic, and while his father saw only limitation, Samuel carried within him a quiet brilliance. He loved patterns, shadows on the wall, the rhythm of rain on glass, the way a horse's hooves struck the ground and even beats. More than anything, he loved the paddocks, where the estate's prized horses grazed. There, he felt safe. There, he didn't need to speak. Among them was a white stallion named Valor. His mane shimmered in the sun like threads of silver, and his eyes held a calm intelligence. While other horses shied away from Samuel's unusual movements, his humming, the way he rocked gently when overwhelmed, Valor never flinched. Instead, he would lower his head, press his muzzle into Samuel's small hands, and stand still, as though guarding him from the rest of the world. Samuel adored him. He spent hours tracing circles in the dirt with a stick while Valor grazed close by. Sometimes, Samuel would lie against the horse's warm flank, listening to the slow thump of his heartbeat. In those moments, the boy who often seemed trapped within himself would smile, a soft, fleeting curve of the lips that the mansion never saw. Life inside the mansion was another story. Edward Hallstrom, Samuel's father, was a man who measured everything in terms of profit and prestige. His empire was oil, his currency power, and his obsession image. To the public, he was flawless, a billionaire philanthropist, a benefactor, a man whose presence commanded respect. But behind the polished facade, Edward's heart was iron. He despised weakness, and to him, Samuel was nothing but weakness embodied. Edward's wife had died years earlier, and with her had gone the only shield Samuel had. Since then, Edward's patience with his son had thinned to almost nothing. The boy's humming embarrassed him at social gatherings. His reluctance to look others in the eye was, to Edward, shameful. And his constant sketches of horses? To Edward, they were a sign of wasted potential, a reminder that his heir was not the son he had wanted. The servants noticed. They pitied Samuel, sneaking him extra bread rolls in the kitchen or whispering encouragement when Edward wasn't near. But fear of their employer kept them silent. None dared defy Edward Hallstrom. Yet, in the quiet fields, Samuel didn't notice their fear. He only knew Valor's steady breath, the soft flick of his ears, and the gentle nudge whenever the boy seemed lost in the storms of his own mind. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Samuel sat in the paddock with a stick, sketching horses in the dust. His humming blended with the wind, soft and rhythmic. Valor stood close, swishing his tail, occasionally leaning down to snuffle Samuel's hair. From the balcony of the mansion, Edward watched. His jaw tightened. A business partner was arriving the next week, and Edward hated the idea of Samuel being seen. But for now, he said nothing. He turned away, muttering under his breath, the boy will never learn. Down below, Samuel pressed his cheek to Valor's neck and whispered in his small, halting voice. "You're my friend." Valor's ears flicked, as though he understood. And in that fleeting twilight, beneath the vast sky, a fragile bond glowed stronger than any wealth inside the mansion walls. For Samuel, it was a moment of peace. For Valor, it was a promise. And for Edward, it was a weakness he would soon decide to crush. The mansion gleamed that night like a palace, its windows spilling light into the darkness of the prairie. Edward Hallstrom was hosting another of his infamous gatherings, where senators, business tycoons, and foreign investors drank champagne and flattered each other beneath chandeliers. Laughter rang through the marble halls, but for Samuel, the sounds were walls closing in. He had been told to stay in his room. But Samuel loved rhythm, and the music from the ballroom, violins swelling, piano keys dancing, pulled him like a magnet. Barefoot, he padded down the corridor, humming softly as he always did, his fingers tracing along the wallpaper's patterns. He stopped at the edge of the ballroom, peering inside. Dozens of men in tailored suits and women in glittering dresses sparkled under the light. To Samuel, they looked like stars moving in circles. He smiled and began humming louder, swaying side to side in time with the music. At first, no one noticed. Then a guest did. "Edward," a man drawled, glass of brandy in hand, "is that your boy?" His tone was mocking, half a laugh already in his throat. "The strange one?" Heads turned. The music faltered. Samuel's humming continued, oblivious to the stairs. He rocked gently, eyes fixed on the chandelier above, its crystals scattering light like tiny constellations. Edward's face flushed. He strode forward, gripping Samuel by the shoulder so hard the boy winced. "What are you doing here?" he hissed. Samuel tried to speak, but words tangled in his throat. All he managed was a hum, louder now, a plea and a shield at once. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, "He's not right, is he?" Another chuckled into their glass. Edward's jaw tightened until it seemed his teeth might shatter. "Excuse us," he muttered coldly, dragging Samuel out of the ballroom. Behind him, the whispers stung sharper than knives. The billionaire's son. Broken. Flawed. Shameful. He didn't stop until they reached the servants' stairwell. He shoved Samuel ahead of him, down the narrow steps that led into the lower levels of the mansion. The boy stumbled, clutching the rail, humming frantically now, panic in his eyes. "Do you understand what you've done?" Edward snarled, his voice low and venomous. "You embarrassed me. In front of men who decide empires." Samuel blinked, lips quivering. His hands flapped at his sides, a gesture that always came when he was overwhelmed. Edward's eyes filled with disgust. "Stop that. Stop it." He unlocked the heavy iron door at the bottom of the stairs. Behind it lay an unused cellar, stone walls slick with damp, the air sharp with mold and cold earth. Rats scurried into corners as the lantern light fell across the floor. Samuel froze at the threshold. He didn't understand everything his father said, but he knew fear. The humming grew louder, shaky now, like a song falling apart. Edward shoved him inside. The boy stumbled onto the rough ground, skin scraping against stone. His drawings, crumpled sketches of horses he always carried folded in his pocket, spilled out, scattering on the floor. One tore beneath Edward's polished shoe as he stepped inside. "You will stay here," Edward growled. "Out of sight. Out of mind. You will not hum. You will not flap your hands. You will not embarrass me again." Samuel's small hands pressed against his ears. His rocking grew faster. Tears blurred his eyes. "Lore," he whispered. It was the only name he trusted, the only comfort he could call. Edward sneered, slamming the door shut. The iron lock clanged, echoing like a sentence. For a moment, silence. Then Samuel's humming returned, soft and trembling, weaving through the stone walls like a fragile thread. He curled into himself in the farthest corner, shivering as the cellar's cold wrapped around him. Above ground, the party roared on. Edward returned to his guests with a glass of wine in hand, the perfect smile fixed on his face. "Apologies," he said smoothly. "A minor distraction." The laughter resumed, and the music swelled once more. But in the earth below, a boy's quiet song carried into the night. And in the paddock, far from the glitter of chandeliers, Valor lifted his head. His ears twitched. His body stiffened. Though no human could hear it, the horse caught the faintest trace of that trembling hum carried by the wind. He pawed the ground once, twice, his breath rising in clouds. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The night pressed heavy around the mansion, but Valor stood restless, eyes fixed toward the cellar no one else would notice. Because while the world drank and danced, only he had heard the boy's silent call. The night had grown colder. A damp mist crept across the prairie, swallowing the Hallstrom estate in silence once the last guests had gone. The chandeliers were dark now, the grand halls empty. But in the paddock, there was no rest. Valor was restless. He had stood watch for hours, his breath steaming in the air, his ears pricked toward the mansion. Something was wrong. He had felt it the moment Samuel vanished from the grounds, the moment the boy's familiar humming, always soft, always near, fell silent. Horses lived by instinct, and Valor's instincts screamed. He pawed at the dirt, circled the paddock, snorted sharply into the night. The stable hand, drowsy in the nearby quarters, muttered, "Easy, boy." Easy, but even he knew this was no ordinary unease. Valor's muscles tensed like drawn bowstrings. His dark eyes flicked again and again toward the ground beneath the mansion, where a faint, muffled hum still echoed. Samuel. Valor could hear what no one else could. That fragile thread of sound, rising through stone and soil, carried not in words but in need. The stallion struck the gate once, hard enough to rattle the latch. His mane shook like a whip of white fire. Again. And again. With a final surge of muscle, the wooden gate splintered. Valor burst into the night, hoofs pounding like a drumbeat of defiance. He galloped straight to the mansion. The servants were the first to hear him. They stumbled from their quarters, lanterns swaying. "What in God's name?" one gasped, as the great white horse thundered past, circling the courtyard with a fury none had seen before. Valor halted suddenly near the old cellar doors, ears straining. His chest heaved as he stomped his hooves against the earth, once, twice, the sound like cannon fire in the stillness. He lowered his head, nostrils flaring, snorting toward the iron-bound door. Inside, Samuel's humming grew louder. Weak, broken, but insistent. The stable hand dropped his lantern, rushing closer. "There's something down there," he whispered, pressing his ear against the door. For a long moment, only silence. Then, soft, unmistakable, a child's voice humming in the dark. His face drained of color. "Sweet Lord, it's the boy." Valor reared suddenly, his hooves striking the iron door so hard the sound rang across the courtyard. Sparks flew where iron met stone. The servants cried out, half in fear, half in awe. The horse was relentless, pounding against the barrier as if he alone could break it open. The noise drew others from the town. Farmers, night watchmen, townsfolk on late errands, all saw the great white horse bathed in moonlight, striking again and again at a locked cellar door. They gathered at the gates, murmuring, lanterns flickering in their hands. "What's he doing?" someone asked. Another voice, trembling, "That's Edward Hallstrom's boy in there." "Has to be." The whispers spread. The crowd swelled. Inside the mansion, Edward stirred from his study, fury simmering. He had tried to bury the boy's existence, to lock away the weakness that threatened his empire. And now, here was his prized stallion, undoing it all. He stormed outside, his robe swirling behind him. "Enough," he bellowed. "Back to your homes, all of you. This is private property." But Valor didn't move. He stood square before the cellar, muscles quivering, head high, as if daring Edward himself to cross him. The crowd fell silent at the sight, a man of untold wealth, powerless before the defiance of a single horse. Edward seized a whip from a stable post, his face twisted. "Get back," he roared, snapping the whip through the air. The crack split the night. Valor didn't flinch. Instead, he struck the door again, and this time, through the screech of tearing metal, the hum from inside swelled louder, breaking into sobs. Samuel's voice. "Clear now." The servants gasped. One fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "He's in there. God help us, he's really in there." The sheriff, roused from his quarters by the commotion, rode in with deputies, pushing through the crowd. He dismounted slowly, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene: a locked cellar, a trembling boy's voice behind it, and a white horse refusing to move aside. "Open it," the sheriff commanded. Edward's face went pale. "You have no right." "I have every right if there's a child in danger." The deputies pushed forward. But before their hands could reach the lock, Valor struck once more. With a groan of metal and stone, the hinges gave way. The iron door sagged open just enough for the lantern light to spill inside. There, curled in the corner, was Samuel. His small frame shook violently, his lips moving in a broken hum, his eyes wide and wet with terror. The crowd gasped. A murmur of horror rippled through them. "Dear God," the sheriff whispered. Samuel lifted his head weakly. His gaze locked on Valor. And for the first time that night, the boy stopped humming. He stretched out his trembling arms, a single word escaping his lips like a prayer. "Valor." The stallion lowered his head, pressing his muzzle gently into the boy's small hands. In that moment, nothing else existed, not the mansion, not the crowd, not Edward's rage. Only a boy and his horse, bound by trust stronger than any iron lock. And in the silence that followed, justice began to stir. The cellar door hung crooked on its hinges, iron bent under Valor's relentless assault. Cold air spilled out, carrying the damp stench of earth and mildew. But what chilled the crowd most was the sight inside: Samuel, small and frail, shivering in the shadows like a forgotten ghost. Gasps echoed. Mothers pressed their children closer. Men shook their heads in disbelief. The boy's lips quivered as he clutched Valor's muzzle, his thin arms wrapped desperately around the horse's neck. "Sweet Lord," someone whispered. "He left his own boy in there." The sheriff stepped forward, lantern high, his face grim. "Edward Hallstrom," he said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of the moment, "what in God's name is this?" Edward's jaw clenched. He straightened his robe, forcing composure. This is a misunderstanding. The boy wandered down here on his own. You know he doesn't think like normal children." His words dripped with disdain. "I locked the door only to keep him safe. To stop him from hurting himself." A murmur rippled through the crowd, doubtful, uneasy. The excuse was thin as smoke. Still, Edward was a man of wealth, and wealth often bent truth. But Valor didn't let him finish. The stallion snorted loud and sharp, stomping a hoof against the ground. His dark eyes burned into Edward's. He shifted, stepping sideways until he stood directly between Edward and the boy, a living wall of muscle and defiance. The crowd fell silent, transfixed. Edward's lips curled into a sneer. "It's a horse. An animal. You'll take its word over mine?" And then came the twist Edward never expected. One of the servants, a middle-aged woman with trembling hands, stepped forward from the crowd. Her eyes brimmed with tears, but her voice, though shaky, was clear. "It's not the first time." All eyes turned to her. She swallowed hard. "I've seen him do it before. Lock Samuel away when guests were here. Said the boy was a disgrace. A stain on his name." Her voice cracked, but she forced herself on. "He told us never to speak of it. We were afraid." "But Valor," she pointed at the horse. Valor wouldn't stay silent. The crowd erupted. Gasps, mutters, anger flaring like fire catching dry grass. The sheriff's jaw tightened. He looked at Edward, whose face was suddenly pale beneath the torchlight. "Is that true?" Edward scoffed, but his voice wavered. "These are lies. She's a servant. Paid to talk. Valor struck the ground again, harder, his hooves ringing like a gavel. The sound reverberated through the square, silencing every denial. Samuel clung tighter to the horse's mane, his tears soaking into white hair. The picture was undeniable, the boy terrified, the horse protective, the father cornered by truth. Another servant stepped forward. Then another. Voices rose, one after another, like a flood breaking through a dam. I heard him scream at the boy. He said Samuel was useless. He told us the child was ashamed to the Hallstrom name. The townsfolk murmured in outrage. Mothers shook their heads, fathers clenched their fists. A man spat on the ground, muttering, locking up his own flesh and blood. The sheriff raised a hand, his face grim as stone. That's enough. He turned back to Edward. You've hidden behind money for a long time. But not tonight. Not with half the town standing here. And not with this horse showing us what you tried to bury. Edward's mask cracked. You'll regret this, he snapped. I'll buy every lawyer in this state. You'll do nothing, the sheriff cut him off, stepping forward. You're under arrest. The deputies moved in, seizing Edward by the arms. He struggled, shouting, this is my estate. You can't touch me. But the crowd only jeered. For once, his wealth held no power. As Edward was dragged back toward the mansion, Valor let out a piercing neigh, rearing high, hooves striking the air. The sound thundered through the night, a cry of victory, of justice. The townsfolk erupted in cheers, some weeping openly. Samuel flinched at the noise, then looked up, wide-eyed, at his horse. Valor lowered his head again, calm now, brushing his muzzle against the boy's cheek. Samuel smiled faintly, the first real smile anyone had seen from him in days. The sheriff knelt by Samuel, softening his tone. You're safe now, son. No one's gonna hurt you again. But Samuel barely looked at him. His gaze stayed fixed on Valor, the only one who had never failed him. The townsfolk began to murmur words of comfort, laying blankets over the boy's shoulders, offering bread, warm milk. For Samuel, the sudden crowd was overwhelming, but Valor stood steady, shielding him with his body. Every time Samuel trembled, Valor shifted closer, as though reminding him, I'm here. You're not alone. The sheriff rose, addressing the crowd. Remember what you saw here tonight. Wealth, power, lies, they all crumble. But truth, he glanced at Valor. Truth has a way of breaking through, even when spoken by those who cannot speak. The crowd nodded, some with tears streaking their faces. They knew this night would be remembered, not for the disgrace of Edward Hallstrom, but for the courage of a boy and the loyalty of a horse who refused to let the truth die in silence. As the deputies hauled Edward away, he twisted to look back, eyes filled with venom. But the image he left behind, the boy clinging to a white horse, the crowd united in outrage, the sheriff standing firm, was one no amount of money could erase. For the first time, Edward Hallstrom was powerless. And for the first time, Samuel was free. The Hallstrom mansion grew quiet after that night. Its grand windows, once blazing with light from parties and laughter of the wealthy, now stood shuttered and dark. Edward Hallstrom no longer strode through its halls with pride, he sat behind iron bars, his empire collapsing around him. The newspapers wrote of his downfall with relish, oil tycoon arrested for child abuse. For a man who lived by image, it was the cruelest punishment of all. But for Samuel, life was only beginning. After Edward's arrest, Samuel was taken in by his aunt, Margaret Hallstrom, a woman of gentle voice and kind eyes, who had been barred from visiting him for years. Margaret lived in a modest house on the edge of town, where curtains fluttered in the breeze and books filled the shelves. It wasn't wealth, but it was home. From the moment Samuel walked through her door, Valor followed, hoofs clopping steadily behind him as though he knew exactly where the boy belonged. Margaret laughed softly when she saw the horse peer through the kitchen window, his great white head filling the frame. Looks like I've got 2 new houseguests, she said with a smile. Samuel's adjustment wasn't easy. The years of neglect had left scars that couldn't vanish overnight. He flinched at sudden noises, clung to routine, and often retreated into silence. But Margaret never hurried him. She listened when he hummed, encouraged his drawings, and read aloud stories about animals, knights, and loyalty, stories Samuel seemed to understand in ways beyond words. And Valor was always there. When Samuel couldn't sleep, he slipped outside to rest against the horse's flank under the stars. When he grew anxious, Valor would nudge his hands gently until the boy's trembling eased. Slowly, Samuel began to trust again, not just the horse, but the world around him. Word of Valor's defiance spread quickly. The townsfolk couldn't stop talking about it, the night a horse had revealed the darkest secret of one of the richest men in the state. Some swore Valor had understood everything, that he knew injustice when he saw it. Others simply said he was the most loyal creature God ever placed on earth. The sheriff, who rarely indulged in sentiment, admitted to Margaret one afternoon, "That horse did what none of us had the courage to do sooner. He made us look." Months later, the town gathered in the square for a ceremony. A bronze plaque was unveiled at the paddock gate where Valor had broken free that night. It read, "To Valor, who showed us that loyalty is stronger than wealth, and justice cannot be silenced." Applause filled the air. Samuel stood beside Valor, his small hand resting on the horse's neck. The boy didn't smile often, but in that moment, he did, a smile so pure it seemed to break something open in everyone watching. Some wiped tears, others bowed their heads in respect. Margaret placed a gentle hand on Samuel's shoulder. "He saved you," she whispered. Samuel leaned into the horse, whispering back, "My friend." For Samuel, that was enough. He didn't need speeches or plaques. He only needed Valor's steady presence, the warmth of a new home, and the knowledge that he was safe. Edward's name faded with time, remembered only as a warning of what cruelty can cost. But Valor's story lived on, retold at suppers, written in local papers, taught to children as a lesson in courage and kindness. And Samuel grew. His drawings of horses filled notebook after notebook, no longer desperate sketches but works of joy, color, and detail. Each one looked a little like Valor, sometimes standing tall, sometimes lying peacefully under a tree, sometimes carrying a small boy on his back toward a horizon bright with light. One summer evening, as fireflies danced above the fields, Samuel sat on the porch steps beside Margaret. Valor grazed nearby, the fading sun turning his white coat to gold. Margaret watched her nephew quietly. He no longer seemed the shadowed child who once rocked in silence inside a locked cellar. He was still different, still humming softly as he drew, but there was peace in his eyes now. "You're strong, Samuel," she said gently. "Stronger than anyone realizes." Samuel tilted his head, thinking. Then he pointed at Valor and whispered, "We're strong." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She couldn't have agreed more. The lesson of their story wasn't written in courts or carved into law. It was written in the bond between a boy and a horse, in the courage of a creature who refused to let silence bury the truth. And long after Edward Hallstrom's empire turned to dust, people remembered what really mattered. Not wealth. Not power. But kindness. Loyalty. Justice.